Hi, and thanks for watching. This Sunday, and in the next few Sundays, in Christian churches, we're going to hear a lot about the resurrection. This Sunday, in a lot of churches, we hear the story of the raising of Lazarus. In a couple of weeks, we have Easter coming up. Of course, the focus is upon the resurrection of Jesus. Now, as modern Christians, one of the things we don't stop and ask ourselves a lot is, what did first century people believe about the resurrection? Was this a commonly accepted, assumed belief among the people of the first century? That's actually a big question. So what I want to do in this video is focus in on one particular group, the Jews, and ask ourselves the question, what did first century Jews believe about the resurrection of the body? Was it believed by everyone? Was it only believed by some Jews? We're going to look at some evidence from the Bible itself, as well as from some other first century BC, first century AD textual sources to answer that particular question. And we're going to relate this all to how we should understand the resurrection of the body. Now, to begin with, if we were to gather a group of first century Jews together in a room and ask them individually, what do you believe about the resurrection of the body? We might receive different answers, because we can't just say, what did first century Jews believe about the resurrection? Because just like today, with all the various Christian churches and confessions out there, so in the first century, there were a divergence of various Jewish groups and opinions with regard to lots of questions, including the resurrection. So just like today, if you were to ask a group of Christians 3 questions, do you believe in the rapture? Do you believe the Pope is the head of the church? Do you believe that babies should be baptized? Well, depending upon the denominational and confessional background of the individual to whom you're talking, of course, you're going to hear different answers. Well, somewhat analogous to that, in the first century, there were various kinds of Jewish confessions, various factions or groups of Jews who held different beliefs. They had many things in common, but they also had different opinions with regard to biblical interpretation as well as belief. So there are 4 main groups of Jews in the first century. Let's talk just a second about those. And these are discussed both in the New Testament as well as in some other resources that we have from around the first century. So there are 4 main groups. One is the Pharisees. We hear plenty about those in the New Testament. Of course, they were the main antagonist of Jesus, right? Jesus was constantly kind of sparring back and forth with the Pharisees. Another group was the Sadducees. We're going to return to them in a moment, but the Sadducees were primarily part of what's sometimes called the priestly aristocracy. They were very connected with the life of the temple, with the priesthood. Thirdly, there were a group that we often associate with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the city of Qumran that's by the Dead Sea, and these were the Essenes. Now, the Essenes were not just located at Qumran. We have evidence from a first century Jewish historian named Josephus, as well as from a Jewish philosopher in Egypt, named Philo, where he talks about the Essenes as well. Now, the Essenes tended to be against the current leadership of the temple. They believed that the current leadership had been corrupted, and so they often separated themselves from the priesthood of the day. And for example, at Qumran, they completely physically isolated themselves from them by setting up this community there by the Dead Sea. So you have the Essenes, who are at Qumran as well as scattered throughout the land of Israel. And then the 4th group are the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were kind of what today we might call the right-wing faction of Judaism. They were extremely anti-Rome, and so they often provoked riots with Rome. And because they were so antagonistic to Rome, they were also antagonistic to fellow Jews, whom they perceived as not being enough against the Roman rulers and the influence of the Greco-Roman culture in Judaism. So you have the Pharisees, you have the Sadducees, you have the Essenes, and you have the Zealots. And of course, it wasn't as if every Jew belonged to one of these 4 groups. You had just typical average Jewish believers, either in the land of Israel or scattered throughout what was called the diaspora, the Roman Empire, who might not have belonged to one of these groups, but they had their own particular beliefs. Now, here's the question. If you were to kind of survey all of these various groups, what do they believe about the resurrection? Well, if we look at the evidence, here's what we come up with. Evidence from the New Testament, evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, evidence from various kinds of Jewish writings in the first century, like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, or a book called Jubilees, or the writings of Josephus, the parts of the Apocrypha. So all of these together provide us with ample evidence to substantiate that, yes, the vast majority of Jews in the first century did believe in the resurrection of the body. They believed that, first of all, those who died would be resurrected. And secondly, that this wouldn't be some sort of spiritual, metaphorical resurrection where people go to an afterlife and lead a bodiless existence as souls. No, when they talked about resurrection, they meant the resurrection of the body. And then thirdly, that they believed that this resurrection would happen either to everyone or at least to believers, to the faithful. And it would happen on the last day, and it would happen simultaneously, meaning that there would be a general resurrection at the end of time. So that was so to answer the question I posed at the beginning, did first century Jews believe in the resurrection? Well, yes, most of them, in fact, did. This separated them, by the way, from basically everyone. If you look at all the various religions of the first century in all their manifestations in the Greco-Roman world, only the Jews believed in the resurrection of the body. This set them apart from basically everyone else in the first century. Now, that being said, did all Jews believe in the resurrection of the body? No, in fact, they did not. We have evidence that one of those four that I talked about a minute ago, the Sadducees, in fact, denied the resurrection of the body. And we have evidence of this both from the New Testament as well as from the first century Jewish historian named Josephus. Now, the New Testament evidence is in a couple of different places. We're going to look at one of those. The other is in the book of Acts, but we're going to look at the one that's in the 22nd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. This is a interaction that Jesus has with the Pharisees. With the Sadducees, excuse me. So the Sadducees come to Jesus, and it says, who say there is no resurrection. So this is the gospel writer Matthew cluing us in on the belief of the Sadducees. He says they say there is no resurrection. And so they pose this question to Jesus, and it's kind of this made-up story, which they think is going to trip up Jesus. And the story basically is this, that there's a man who dies, and he doesn't have any children, so he leaves his wife without any children, and according to the Jewish law, when that happened, another brother would marry her, and he would raise up children for his deceased brother. And so they go through this, and they say this woman was married to 7 different brothers, and none of them had any children with her. So in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Now, of course, Jesus has his response to this, in which he shows them that there is no marrying or giving of marriage in the resurrection. And then he refutes them with a quote from the book of Exodus, in which he says that God is the God of the living and not of the dead. He is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. But the main thing I want to focus in on the fact is that the Sadducees here, according to the Gospel of Matthew, say there is no resurrection. But it's not just in the New Testament that we have evidence for this. We also have it from Josephus. So Josephus, who lived from around 37 AD to around 100 AD, so the latter half of the first century AD, he, in a couple of different places in his writings, he talks about various kinds of Jewish groups, including the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and the Zealots. And when he talks about the belief of the Sadducees, in 2 different books, he says this. First of all, in the book of Wars, he says the Sadducees take away the belief in the immortal duration of the soul and the punishments and rewards in Hades. And then in another writing, Antiquities, he says, but the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the bodies. Now keep in mind that Josephus is writing for a Greek audience. He's writing in Greek for Greeks. He's trying to often explain the beliefs of the Jews to his Gentile audience. And so very often he will couch Jewish beliefs in Greek philosophical kind of language so that his readers can kind of understand where he's coming from. So that's why he describes the belief of the Sadducees in the way that he does. But the main point from both the Gospel of Matthew as well as from Josephus is that, yes, most Jews believed in the resurrection of the body, but the group of the Sadducees did not. They denied the resurrection of the body. Now, for those Jews who did believe that there would be this resurrection, upon what basis did they believe this? Well, they believed it on the basis of their own scriptures, on the basis of the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament. And there were a number of passages that we could look at, but I want to look at briefly at 3 different passages that come up time and time again in various kinds of Jewish writings from the first century. So, one of these is from Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19, where Isaiah writes, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead." So Isaiah says the earth will give birth to those who have died and who have been buried there. So there is going to be this joyful resurrection. And this resurrection is connected with the exodus that the Messiah is going to bring about. So in that same context, in Isaiah chapter 26, he's talking about this forthcoming exodus that is going to be enacted by the Messiah. Secondly, we can look at the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 12, where we have this famous passage in which he writes, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So Daniel, too, is talking about this resurrection that's going to happen. And there's 2 different groups, right? Some will rise to glory and some will rise to everlasting contempt. And bear in mind, too, that when he says they will be like the stars in heaven, he's not necessarily talking about the bright glory of the resurrected body. Instead, in the ancient world, in the Old Testament included, stars are often connected with those who are rulers. So when Daniel says they will be like the stars, he's not talking so much about how they're going to sparkle or shine brightly. He's talking about the fact that the resurrected will reign. And this, of course, accords with some of the language in the New Testament where it says that those who are resurrected will reign with Christ, right? We will be as kings and queens. So we'll be like stars in that respect. One more passage that we should look at is from the prophet Ezekiel. It's a famous vision that he had in chapter 37 of his writings. And this is, it's a long section. I'm only going to look at the opening verses. Ezekiel says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley. And behold, they were very dry. And he said to me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' And I answered, 'O Lord God, you know.' Then he said to me, 'Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord.'" Now, if you read the rest of the vision, you know that the Spirit came and filled these bodies with life again. They stood up this vast army. This particular vision of Ezekiel is primarily concerned with promising Israel that she will come back from exile. That exile is the place of death, and God will resurrect. He will repatriate Israel from this place of death in order to bring them back to life and freedom once more in the land of Israel. Now, we know from other first century texts, from some, for instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that not only was this vision understood to be a prophecy of the return from exile, but it was also understood to be a prophecy of the resurrection. That Ezekiel wasn't just talking about a return from Babylon, but he was talking about a return from death itself. That Ezekiel was describing a true resurrection in which those who were dead in the grave would be brought back to life and raised up in these new bodies that are filled with the Spirit of life. So those are 3 Old Testament passages. There's a whole lot more that we could look at in the Psalms as well as in the book of Job, but those are the ones that come up very frequently in first century writings that talk about the resurrection. Now, I want to clarify one thing because you might be thinking, well, weren't there resurrections in the Old Testament? Weren't various individuals resurrected? And even in the New Testament, don't we have stories of resurrection? So how do these kind of fit into the overall picture? Well, let me clarify something. Yes, in fact, we do have instances in both the Old Testament and New Testament of individuals, I'm not talking about Jesus, but just of individuals, other individuals who were raised to life. So, for instance, we have in the Old Testament the story of a widow of Zarephath whose son was raised after he died. Once more, we have another son, the son of a Shunammite, who was raised to life again. And we have a strange story about a man who was about to be buried, and he was dropped into a grave in which the bones of Elisha were lying. And when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he came back to life. We have those Old Testament stories about 3 different people who were dead and who came back to life. We also have in the New Testament the story of Jesus raising the widow's son at Nain. We have him raising Jairus' daughter. And of course, we have the famous story of Jesus raising Lazarus. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that even though we often call these resurrections, I think we should think of them as maybe temporary resurrections. And what I mean by that is that, yes, these people were dead, they were brought back to life, but they were brought back in the same bodies that they had before they died. The same bodies that were mortal and would die again. So that's what I mean by a temporary resurrection. So they truly died, they were truly brought back to life, but they didn't have glorified immortal bodies. They would die again. The sons who were raised in the Old Testament, the man who fell into Elisha's grave, Lazarus, the widow's son at Nain, Jairus' daughter, they died twice basically. So even though we might call these a resurrection, it's not the exact same kind of resurrection that, for instance, is going to happen at the end of time. But these were all looking forward to that resurrection. They were previews, if you will, of the true resurrection that's going to happen at the last day. Now, to jump to the story of Lazarus, here we have a dialogue between Martha, who was the sister of Lazarus, and Jesus talking about belief in the resurrection. And I think this particular dialogue is going to help us to understand a clarification about first century Jewish belief concerning the resurrection that's going to help us to understand exactly what Jesus, the way that Jesus opened people's eyes to a different and a deeper understanding of the resurrection. So Lazarus has died. He's been in the grave for 4 days. Jesus shows up and Martha comes out to him and they have this dialogue. And here's how it goes. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." Now, the reason that this is so significant is because Martha stands there, as it were, the spokesperson of first century Jewish belief concerning the resurrection. She says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that my brother is going to rise again on the last day." That's what most Jews believed. Jesus is clarifying this by saying to Martha, "Listen, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life." So in me is the promise of resurrection. He's not denying that Lazarus would rise on the last day, but what he's about to prove is that he himself is the resurrection. He embodies the power of God for the resurrection. So what's going to happen as Jesus himself is resurrected and the church is founded and people begin to go back to the scriptures, to the Old Testament scriptures, and to reread these in light of Easter, is that they're going to begin to understand that, yes, in fact, there will be a resurrection on the last day. But the reason there's going to be a resurrection on the last day is entirely based upon the resurrection of Jesus. who is the resurrection and the life. So what Jesus does by his resurrection is he brings the future into the present, and in his resurrection guarantees the fact that there will be a resurrection in the future. So to use the language of some of the church fathers, just like if a person is lying down and they stand up, their head goes up first and then the body follows, the church fathers would say, just as the head rises, so must the body. What they mean by that is just as Jesus, the head of the church, rises, so will his body. So Jesus is the reason for the resurrection on the last day. And his resurrection was such a shock because even though the Jews were expecting that there would be a resurrection on the last day, they weren't expecting there to be this kind of resurrection of the Messiah in order to provide the power of the resurrection of all at the last day. And we see this, for instance, we see this clarification happening in that famous story in Luke chapter 24 when Jesus, on the day of his resurrection, appears to the two Emmaus disciples as they're walking home. And they don't recognize him, of course, and he comes up and says, why are you so downcast? And they talk about how disappointed they were that Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified because they were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And Jesus says this to them. He says, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Jesus is opening up the eyes of these two Emmaus disciples to truly understand the scriptures, that the death of the Messiah and his resurrection were prophesied there, that Moses talked about this, David talked about this, the prophets talked about this. So when these two Emmaus disciples and the other followers of Jesus began to reread the Old Testament in light of the resurrection, they began to see that not only in Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, but in Psalm 16, in Job, in Exodus, all over the place. Yes, in fact, the Old Testament scriptures did talk about not just the resurrection on the last day, but the resurrection of the Messiah himself, and that he is the resurrection and the life. So we might say that the Old Testament is best read in the light of the empty tomb. You read the Old Testament as you're sitting outside this empty tomb with the brilliance of that resurrection shining on the page. And then we began to truly understand what these scriptures have talked about. So, to wrap everything up, to answer the question, did first century Jews believe in the resurrection of the body? Yes, most of them did. We have some exceptions, such as the Sadducees, and some small groups or individuals, such as Philo in the land of Egypt. But the vast majority of Jews from the first century, yes, they were expecting the resurrection, but they were expecting this resurrection to happen at the end of time. They weren't expecting what happened with Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus became the means by which resurrection was understood. And we know and believe that because the Messiah was resurrected, that we shall rise in him. In fact, in baptism, we have already been crucified and resurrected with him, so that we have this down payment, this guarantee of our future bodily resurrection, where we will be like our Lord. So this, I hope, has been helpful to you as an explanation of exactly what was believed in the first century about the resurrection by Jews and by the various Jewish groups, and I hope it's provided some clarification to you with regard to the New Testament and the resurrection of Jesus as well. One of the things that happened when the Christian church began is that this kind of peripheral belief about the resurrection among Jews of the first century moved to the center. As Christianity began within Judaism and then expanded beyond that to include more and more Gentiles, this message of Christ raised from the dead became the message of the church. It was a phenomenal message, a life-changing message, the message that enabled the church to spread the good news of Christ crucified and risen for us all over the world. So again, thank you so much for watching. And I pray that this will help you to understand Old Testament stories, as well as the raising of Lazarus, and most importantly, the resurrection of Christ himself. So may God bless you, and may he watch over you during this difficult time, and may he grant you all the peace and the great joy that comes from knowing that Christ has been resurrected for you, and because of that, you too shall be raised on the last day to walk in glorified, resurrected bodies in the presence of our resurrected Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Have a great day.